Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on performing different types of trials in the same experiment in Experiment Builder. Today, we're going to talk about the best practices for how to do something like this in Experiment Builder. And first, let me jump to the agenda. First, I'll give a brief overview of how Experiment Builder works generally, mostly so I can point you to another resource, Experiment Builder video tutorial series that you can check out in case you're not familiar with Experiment Builder generally. Then we're going to talk about what not to do when setting up an Experiment Builder project in terms of like setting up a project that will have different trial types. So there are some common mistakes people make, and I just want to point out what those mistakes are and how to avoid them. And then finally, we'll talk about the best practices for handling separate trial types in Experiment Builder. And we'll do that in the context of a study test example. And that Experiment Builder example will be posted at the same forum thread where this webinar is, as well as a video of the webinar and this PowerPoint. Okay, so let's just first talk about an overview of how Experiment Builder works. So let me exit out of this. I'm going to bring up this study test project, and I'm just going to briefly show you that you can see Experiment Builder has a graphical user interface. And basically, to create an experiment, you drag and drop these different nodes into the graph editor space here, and you connect those nodes to one another. And when you run to create kind of like a flow chart of your experimental design, and then when you run the project, it will go through the nodes in the order that they're connected. And if you want to get some more background on how Experiment Builder works, you can check out our support forums, sr-support.com. And when you go into there, you can go to video tutorials and then find this Experiment Builder video tutorial series. And that will give you some kind of deeper background on how Experiment Builder works generally. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. So first, let's discuss what not to do in Experiment Builder. Okay, for most experiment structures, you're not necessarily going to have like big differences from one trial to another. So like, for example, you might have a picture experiment, and from one trial to another, the general procedure is the same, but the image that you're going to show from trial to trial will change. And so for those types of small changes, you don't need to do anything like what we're discussing today in the webinar. Instead, you can basically create what's called a data source, which you can learn about from that video tutorial series. And in that data source, add a column that specifies the information that needs to change from one trial to another. So here you can see we have the image file name that will change from one trial to another. And then you set up kind of like a skeleton of the basic trial structure. And from the properties of the different nodes and screen resources in your trial structure, you can make a reference to those relevant data source columns, and then that way you use different information from one trial to another. So for minor changes across trials, there's no need to do what we're discussing here. Okay, if you do need to, if you have like major trial like procedure differences from one trial to another, like in a study test paradigm, then here's another thing that you shouldn't do. So this is a kind of a common mistake that I've seen from people who are new to Experiment Builder. They basically will set up kind of two sequences, like let's say for study trials and test trials, they'll set up like one sequence that will iterate through all the study trials and another sequence that will iterate through all the test trials. And each of these sequences would have its own data source. And that's kind of a no-no for several reasons. First of all, it's just kind of inefficient programming. So basically you're building up like in a lot of ways some redundant structuring, and it's inefficient because it kind of wastes the video card resources when you run the project. But more importantly, it's also kind of inefficient because it leads to multiple data sources, which will each have their own set of data source columns. And all of those data source columns become what are called trial variables in data viewer, in data analysis. And that would mean basically you'll have almost double the amount of trial variables in data analysis, and you'll have to like sort out which trial variables apply to which trials when you're analyzing your data, and that can lead to a lot of confusion. So it's best to avoid that. But then also another important thing is that if you set up your structuring like this, then it limits you in terms of your trial randomization options. So if you set things up like this, then all the trials that are part of this, the data source associated with study trials, would have to come before all the trials with the data source associated with the test trials, and that limits your ability to do certain types of randomization tricks. So just generally, we don't ever want to have like multiple, or very rarely we would have multiple sequences, each with its own data source. So that's a no-no. Okay, and now let's jump into the optimal structure. So for almost any type of experimental design where you have different trial procedures from one trial to another, this is the way you want to set things up. So the idea is you would have one trial sequence. So we can see here on this left side, we have a trial sequence, and it has a data source associated with it. This is from the study test example that we're about to discuss. And so this sequence is going to iterate through all of the trials, all of the study trials and all of the test trials. And then on each trial, it's going to, you can see this panel over here shows the contents of the trial sequence. On each trial, it's going to get to this conditional trigger, which is going to check a data source column that specifies the trial type and then direct the experimental flow to the appropriate subsequence, which will contain the events that need to happen for that trial type. So you can see on each iteration of the trial sequence, we're going to make a decision about which type of trial this is, and then go to the appropriate recording sequence, either a study sequence or a test sequence. And this is definitely the way you want to do things in general in Experiment Builder. So this stuff being said, now let's take a look at the study test example that will be posted along with this video. Okay, so I have it open here, and let's zoom in a little bit. So this is the very beginning of the experiment. You can see in this experiment, like a lot of our other examples, it starts off with some instructions that give basically calibration instructions, waits for a key press, and then does the eye tracker calibration via this camera setup node. Then we hit a block sequence, which is going to iterate 4 times. So in this example, we're going to have one block of study, one block of test, another block of study, and another block of test. So we have 4 blocks in total. Okay, and if we double click and go inside of that block sequence, we can see that what we do is on each block, we need to, before the block begins, present some instructions for the block. So I'm using kind of this same trick here. Basically, we're going to determine whether to do study or test instructions via this conditional trigger. And the way conditional triggers work is you set up some kind of logical comparison here in its properties. And if that logical comparison evaluates to true, then it follows the little check mark here, and we'll go down this path. And if that logical statement evaluates to false, you follow the X mark path and go down there to the study instructions. So let's take a look. You can see this logical comparison is checking. If you want to take a look at what these things are doing, you can click on this button to bring it up. It's basically, let's delete it and remake it again. So what it's trying to do here is say, are we in an odd numbered block or an even numbered block? And so the way we can do that is use a little bit of Python trickery. Python is the scripting language of Experiment Builder. So what you can do is type equals and then make a reference to the blocks iteration property by double clicking on that, and see how it inserted that reference up there. And so that will check the blocks iteration, but we're going to have block 1, 2, 3, and 4 as we go through the different blocks. And so if we want to check to see if it's an even numbered block, then we can use this mod operator which is handled via this percent sign. And so basically this takes the current block iteration and then divides it by 2, but instead of returning just the result of that division, it returns the remainder of that division. So if we're in block 1, 1 divided by 2 is 0, remainder 1. So the remainder there is 1. If we're in block 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1, remainder 0. If we're in block 3, 3 divided by 2 is 1 with remainder 1. And if we're in block 4, 4 divided by 2 is 2, remainder 0. So this is always returning the remainder of that division. And what we're saying is if that remainder is 0, then that means we must be in an even number block. And so in that case, we'll go to test, we'll follow this true path and go to the test instructions. If we're in an odd number block, we'll follow the false path and go to the study instructions. And so you can see we just have different instructions here. So for the test, we give instructions on how to respond to the test question. And on the study phase, we'll get some instructions about the study phase. So basically in the study blocks, the participant is just going to see a series of pictures, each presented for 2 seconds. And their task is just to remember those pictures. And then in the test block, they're going to see some of those old pictures that they saw previously and some new ones. And their task is to respond as to whether this is an old picture that they studied or a new picture that they did not study. So they're going to press one of 2 keys, Z for old and / for new picture. Okay, so that's how the block sequence is structured. And then we're going to hit this trial sequence. And this trial sequence is going to iterate through all 24 of our trials. So we're going to have a block of 4 test trials, a block of 4 study trials, a block of 8 test trials, another block of 4 study trials, and then a final block of 8 test trials. And so this is the sequence that's going to have our data source associated with it. And you can see it has 24 rows because of those 24 trials that I mentioned. But we don't want to go through all 24 rows on each iteration of the outer block sequence. And so what we have here is a split by property that is set to 4, 8, 4, 8. And that means on the first block, we're going to do 4 iterations of this sequence. On the second block, we're going to do 8 iterations of this sequence. Third block, 4, and fourth block, 8. Okay, so this is going to iterate through all our trials and handle the presentation of the different trial events for both types of trials. And if we want to access its data source, we can click on this data source property on its value box here, and that will bring up our data source. And let me just expand these so you can read those column names. So we have a few columns here. Trial ID is just a unique identifier for each trial type. Image is going to be the different image file that is used on each trial of the experiment. Trial type distinguishes whether this is a study trial or a test trial. Test condition doesn't apply for the study trial, so that's set to not applicable for those. And then for the test trials, it's set to either old or new. Old are the pictures that they studied during the test trial, during the study phase, and new are new pictures that were not studied during the study phase or study block. Okay, and then during the test block, we have a test correct response column, which specifies which key they should press during the test block. And so they should press either Z for the old pictures or / for the new pictures. And this is not applicable to the study block. And then finally, we have a block column, which is 1, 2, 3, or 4 for our different blocks of the experiment. And that's used just to allow our randomization constraints, which are and this is discussed in more detail in another video and webinar in our Experiment Builder video tutorial series and in some webinars. So you can see here we're constraining our randomization by block, and then within blocks we're randomizing the order of the trials. And so that's the way we kind of control. We're going to randomize this we're going to randomize this data source column ultimately, but we want to make sure that the study trials stay together and the test trials stay together. And we want to make sure that we're not randomizing the order of blocks. So that's how we've set up the randomization setting here. Okay, Now let's go back to our trial sequence. And now we're like inside the trial sequence. Another way you can get to that is go to the block sequence, and you can see this is the sequence that's going to be iterating 24 times, and we can double click on it. And now we're inside that sequence. And at the beginning of the sequence, we're going to reset some dependent variables that are used in the test phase to store our reaction time, accuracy, and which key was pressed. And so we double click that, we can see we're just resetting those variables. You can see more about that in the video tutorial series. Then we're going to hit our conditional trigger, which in this case is going to determine which recording sequence we're going to go to. And so you can see the logic for this one is referencing our trial type data source column. So our data source column called trial type, which, to remind you, is this column here, right here, which specifies study or test. And if it is a test trial, then we're going to direct our experimental flow over here to the right, prepare the trial, do a drift check, and then enter the recording sequence for the test phase. If it's not a test phase, that must mean it's a study trial. And so we're going to follow the false path and go over here to the study phase, to the recording sequence for the study trials. So let's take a look at the study trials. Basically, on these trials, we have a display image, display screen action. And if we double click on it, we can see we just have an image resource here. And if we select that image resource, we can see that that image resource's source file name refers to our data source column image, which specifies the file name of that image. And so that's the way we change the image file that's used from one trial to another. Then that stays up for 2 seconds because we have a 2-second timer trigger that follows it, and then we clear the screen. Okay, so that's all that happens in the study phase. Then in the test phase, which we'll get to if this evaluates to true because we're in a test trial, we'll go over here and we'll similarly present an image. And so I've just made the image resource a little smaller in this case by changing its width and height properties. And this one has a similar reference for its source file name property to the image column, so not much has changed there. But we have a little text resource reminder to press Z if you saw this picture previously, or slash if you did not. So that's just a little reminder just for this example. Okay, so then after they see that image, they can press a key, and that's handled by a keyboard trigger here. And you can see only slash and Z are allowed as the acceptable keys. So I double clicked on that, selected those keys, and then that's how I configured that. Or if they don't press a key, it looks like in 8 seconds, then the trial will time out. And after it times out, it goes to a blank screen. If they do press a key, then we check whether the key that was pressed that caused that keyboard trigger to fire, if that matches our data source column test correct response, then we're going to set our variables. And by variables, I mean these guys here in one way. So if it matches, we're going to set accuracy to 1. We're going to log the key that was pressed to the key press variable, and we're going to set the reaction time. This stuff is covered more in the video tutorial series as well. If it doesn't match, then we'll set the variables almost in the same way, except we'll set accuracy to 0, and then we'll end the trial. And I also added a results file just so we could have like a tab delimited text file that would log the behavioral data that we're collecting. This data is also going to be automatically logged to the eye tracking EDF file whenever the recording sequence ends. But if we wanted to have just a simple behavioral data file, then you can do that by adding results file here, and then at the end of the trial, use an add to results file, this node here, to add a different row to that tab delimited text file that will log the values of these variables and these data source columns. Okay, and so that's the way we can have a study and test, basically have different trial structures within the same experiment. So now that we've kind of walked through this, let's just do a quick test of the experiment. So I'm going to turn on I have a webcam pointed at my screen because when you do a test run, I've discovered that this webinar software, when you run an experiment builder project, it kills the screen recording. So I'm going to turn on my webcam so that you can see what happens. Okay, that should be on now. Let me get it pointed a little better. Okay, and close the preview here. And let's do a run. So I'll do a test run here. And this is just warning we're doing a test run, so this shouldn't be used for real data collection. That's fine. Then it's gonna build the project quickly, and then it's going to ask us for the EDF file, the eye tracking data file. I actually have this set up to run in a dummy mode, which you can configure under the devices tab when you go to the iLink section of the devices tab here. And that will basically prevent us from connecting to the host PC in case we don't have an eye tracker with us. So I'm gonna say, okay, well, first I'll just accept the EDF file name, and then it's gonna say we're in dummy mode and some eye tracking functionality won't be available. So let's say okay to that. And first we see the instructions for the eye tracker calibration. I'm just gonna press the key to get out of that. And now we're in the camera setup mode, where we would normally calibrate the eye tracker, but since we're in dummy mode, we don't need to do that. So I'm gonna press escape in dummy mode. That's how you get past the camera setup mode. And then we'll see the instructions for the study block, and I'll press a key to get past that. And after I start the study block, we're gonna see a drift check appear at the beginning of each trial. And since we're in dummy mode, that's just gonna briefly appear and then disappear. And then we'll start the trial. So you can see we're in the study block and we're seeing the images that we're supposed to be studying. So we had some flowers, a plane, like a potted plant, some more flowers, and now we're on to the test block. And this gives us instructions, Z for old picture, / for new. Okay, I think we saw that previously, so I'll press Z. And I don't think we saw that, so I'll press /. I also don't think we saw that, but I'm gonna say old just so we can check. I can't remember if we saw it or not, but I think we didn't. I'll press /. And I think we did see this previously, so I'll say Z for old. I don't think we saw that. I think we did see that, and I actually flew in that plane, so I will never forget it. We didn't see that. Okay, now we're going to our next study block. So, okay, we've got a guy riding a bike. We have 3 people riding bikes. We have structure in Ottawa and some flowers. Okay, now we're on to the next test block. Okay, that's not the same picture, so I'm gonna press new, / for new. I think we did see this, so I'll press Z for old. I think we saw this too, 3 people. We did not see those guys. We didn't see them either. And I think we did see him. And we did not see them. Okay, so that's changing of the guard in Ottawa. Okay, last one. And then it ends. Okay, so that's how you can do different experimental trials. Let me turn off my webcam for a second. And just to show you, I'm gonna navigate to my experimental folder. I'm gonna show you the results file really quickly. So I'll go to, I just set up a webinars folder here, and I'll go to performing different trial types. And this is our project folder, and I can go into our results subfolder, and there's our results. And I'm just gonna open this with Excel, which I have on this computer. And this will give us our behavioral data for the different trials. It looks like I got a couple wrong there, but I got most of them right. So good for me. Okay, so if anybody has any questions about how to do these different trial types within the same experiment, don't hesitate to get in touch. You can send us an email at support@sr-research.com, or you can, let me just write that, support@sr-research.com, or you can check out our forums or call us, whatever you want to do to get in touch. We're happy to answer any questions. And stay safe and healthy, everybody, and we'll see you at the next webinar.